Hello, very beautiful community. Now, let's talk about the way the war, Ukraine's war on Russian soil, grows. We've been talking about it since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And it's still a dramatic part of the news cycle, even as Trump conducts his imbecilically unplanned through war in the Middle East. In the last day, we have seen dramatic pictures from Primorsk, where the Ukrainians attacked a Russian oil port, placed not far from St. Petersburg. And there are really two principles that loosely but still helpfully apply to the way we should think about the future of Ukraine's war on Russian soil. The first principle is that the more the front line is stuck, and of course, the front line for us non-military experts is some kind of definite line along the front that we magically think of. It is no such thing in practice, but for the purposes of our chat, let's call it that, and say that if it is roughly stuck, then Ukrainian operations on Russian soil will magnify, and Russian operations against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, Russian attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure that had such a strong terroristic dimension this winter, actually, because they were specifically thought of in the Kremlin as a psychological operation to generate political instability in Ukraine, so that Ukrainians would turn on their government, would turn on themselves. And that's actually a very interesting subject, very important part of how Putin proceeds. And I made a video about that on the main channel, which you must see if you haven't done it yet, a few weeks ago. And so I'll put that at the end of this video. But that's the first principle. The more the front line is stuck, the more we're going to see this sort of seeping out of the war onto Russian territory progressively. The second principle that's also loose but important is that the more Western support for Ukraine weakens, the more Ukraine's operations on Russian territory will be magnified. Because one of the limiting factors on Ukraine has been that Ukraine has wanted to avoid certain kinds of bad PR for itself that would not look pretty in Western capitals, which might become less enthusiastic about carrying on supporting Ukraine. The less support Ukraine gets, the more untied its hands will be about what it does on Russian territory. And that means that we can expect, even though it feels like the war has sort of got into its motions and we're talking about the same patterns over and over, but I still think we can expect more significant and more dramatic events to occur on Russian soil, which haven't occurred yet, and one of these might be a mass casualty event. Now, having given a little bit of political analysis, I want to talk about the psychological impact on both oppositional Russians and the depoliticized blob in the middle, that 50 or 60% of the population in Russia thinks itself to be outside of politics. I want to talk about the psychological impact of Ukraine's war on Russian soil on these folks via looking together at a clip. So what we're going to watch is a 2-minute clip from Katya Gordeeva, a Russian cultural figure, interviewing the exiled author Boris Akunin and asking him a question that is going to feel very, very strange to all of you about the way Russians are ethically processing Ukrainian strikes on their territory. And we'll break down what's going on, because what's going on there needs an explanation, and we can actually give it, but it's a very surprising one. Okay, so I'm going to try to do live translation as we go. So let's see if I succeed. Let's press play. Russia in 2014 attacked Ukraine. In the process, it occupied a part of Ukrainian territory. In 2022, it began a full-scale, monstrous war against Ukraine. Ukraine, fighting back against Russia, has struck Russian territory. People live there, many of whom had nothing to do with the planning or support of the war. They don't support the war. How should a person ethically resolve this dilemma? Because you see, one of the ethical forks here is that if you support Ukraine, you must also support Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory. That's war. I've already answered this question, and I got a prison sentence for it. I think that this is war. Ukraine has the right to defend itself. If Ukrainian territory is under attack, Ukraine has the right to deliver retaliatory strikes. And it's strange that this point of view is even considered terroristic by anybody. This is how wars are always fought. This is a horrible, dreadful situation. But Ukraine is a victim of aggression. She has been attacked. Otherwise, we get this really strange story about how our vile and treacherous enemy is treacherously firing from air defense batteries onto our bombers that are peacefully bombing it. But what do you say to people who say, yeah, Ukraine is defending itself, but let it defend itself inside its territory? Well, you stay inside your own borders. Who called you to go there? What are you doing there? You're bringing destruction and devastation there. And what, you can't be strike back? I can't even understand how this question is formulated. But it's a formulation of a question that's available. Well, I know it's available, but it's idiotic. You're gonna hit me, and I'm not gonna hit you back. What on earth is going on there, beautiful community? This is bloody weird. How on earth can Russians have a situation where their government has attacked Ukraine and they are confused about why they're being struck back? And just before I get to the main point, I wanted to come in here and make it just a 60-second philosophical clarification that I thought wasn't necessary, but actually is. There's, of course, a basic ethical misunderstanding of war in Katya Gordeeva's question, namely that when you've got a defensive existential war, ethical considerations like is this just or unjust go out of the way and are replaced by considerations of necessity. So it's not unjust for Ukraine to attack Russia. It's rather neither just nor unjust. Justice goes out of the way here and is replaced by other values like necessity, survival, the sustenance of one's state. There's a risk of over-ethicizing the basic categories of war when we talk about is this justified or is this not. Back to the video. We made 2 videos on the main channel about Ukraine's invasion of Kursk. And one of the things we talked about is the concept of borderlessness. And the concept of borderlessness is very important culturally and psychologically when you think about Russian imperialism. Because it's not just that Russian imperialism comes with a propensity for the acquisition of territories. It also comes with a propensity for indifference to its own territories. Right? It's not that there's a feeling that this is Russia and everything else outside isn't, and we can conquer some of it and that's good. It's that Russia doesn't begin or end. Right? And that's indeed the sort of posters that Putin's had put up all over the country. And so there's a certain sense in which Russians don't think that their territory is quite their own. And a certain sense in which they think their government isn't quite their own. And so in Kursk, what would have surprised you if you could be a sort of anthropologist on the ground during the occupation is that quite definitely, at least at the level of principle, some Russians would have had the thought available to them, well, I don't care whether I live under Russian or Ukrainian governance, as long as I'm with the better of the 2 options. Right? So there's this dramatic asymmetry between a scenario where hypothetically, let's say the Russians took Kiev, and a hypothetical scenario where Ukraine took Moscow. If the Russians took Kiev, it would not be much solace for residents of the Ukrainian capital anymore. That, let's wave another magic wand here and say that the Russians could somehow bring better economic conditions, which they couldn't. They bring devastation and apartheid in bits of eastern Ukraine they control. But let's just be hypothetical here. And Ukrainians could live economically a little bit better under Russian rule than Ukrainian rule. They wouldn't want it, on the whole. And they wouldn't want it because they would have been captured by a foreign state, and they would therefore be in jail, politically speaking. The Russians wouldn't react in the same way if Ukraine captured Moscow. The radical folks who might substantively support the war, who tap out at below 20% of the population, would be outraged by such occupation. But, and I'm of course making an exaggeration here, but nevertheless it's true that the degree to which the depoliticized blob in the middle in Russia would be able to transactionally relate to that scenario is stunning. All right, it's Tuesday and we're under a new authority. We were under a different authority on Monday. All right, what's the change mean? What are the 7 things I've got to do to adjust to this crap? I had this old crap, now I've got this new crap. I mean, let me see, if this is better, if this is worse, and what I have to do to adapt. So that is a colonial relationship with your own government. You relate to your government not as your government, but as a colonial force that has control over territory which you occupy. And if that control lapses and is replaced by another control, you could ask all kinds of questions like, how is that going to affect my private life? Am I going to earn less? Am I going to earn more? Am I going to be more safe, less safe? I tell you what, if you promised membership of the European Union with that Ukrainian occupation of Moscow, there'd be quite a few people who would be happy to take it. So it's this extraordinarily strange relationship to their government, as though it were kind of colonial rule, and the government relates to them that way too. Even in the latest event of the turning off of the internet in Russian cities is a kind of a colonial attitude. Well, these buggers can just get on with it. I'm sure they won't squeal about it too much. We're just going to play around with this and see, what we can learn about what we need to do in the future, about cutting these guys off from information, cutting these guys off from politically connecting with each other to organize something that could threaten the regime. So it's colonial rule mentality that explains this, because it's not we who attacked Ukraine, it's the government that happens to have power on territory on which I live that attacked Ukraine. So what have I got to do with it? Right? I don't have any, I pay taxes, okay, but I have to. So what have I got to? It's nothing to do with me at all. You guys, right, have to understand that it's the Kremlin folks. You've got a problem. You don't have a problem with me. I didn't do anything. I don't even know what the war is about. I'm not interested in what the war is about. And that is a radically different attitude to the attitude of Ukrainians. Because right now, Ukrainians, who for the most part are not going to be entirely impressed with Zelensky, right? They have criticisms of Zelensky, but they accept that he is their wartime legitimate leader. And so when their government does something, they have a sense of it being something that we are doing. It's a fragile we, it's a complicated we. We shouldn't romanticize the degree of atomization and level of low social trust in Ukrainian society. But we also shouldn't underestimate the mobilization politically, and we also shouldn't underestimate the degree to which Ukraine has a different political culture to Russia and a different set of political mythologies inflecting it, right? Ukrainians can't quite have the feeling when their government does something major that we didn't do anything. It's these guys who happen to have power over territory. But Russians do feel like that. And that is the central reason why this question that Katya Gordeeva is asking, which it is, by the way, I don't actually know whether she's a little bit politically delusional and she buys into that question to some degree. But even if she didn't at all, it will be appropriate for her to ask that question, because it's a question that a minority of oppositional Russians are asking and many of the depoliticized blob in Russia are asking. These guys live under what they conceive of as colonial rule. And because of that, they don't have the identification with their own government to have feelings like, we did this to you. We did this to you, Ukrainians, and we're sorry. So I wanted to articulate that because that is a hyper example of just how toxic depoliticization can get, right? And that's why depoliticization in its various but related forms as a global disease is something that we're so obsessively preoccupied with on this channel, on these channels. Thank you for being with me, beautiful community, and talk soon.